Is there one right way to deal with your debt? Should you pay off your credit cards before saving for retirement? And what's a simple way to avoid doing dumb things with your money? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 48th episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey everybody, welcome to podcast number 48. Hey, I hope you could do me a favor. If you've been enjoying the show, could you take a minute and give me an honest review on iTunes? You have an opportunity there to give a rating and a review. And those reviews help me a lot. They help me, one, make the show better and to improve it. And two, the ratings actually help how iTunes makes these shows available when you're searching for podcasts within iTunes. And so if I can get more reviews and ratings, it actually helps other folks find the show. And so I'd be really grateful if you could do that. Just takes a minute. Again, an honest review of the show would help me out a lot. And the easy way to get to iTunes is just to go to DoughRoller.net/iTunes. That directs you right to the page where this podcast resides, obviously. You can also check it out through the iTunes app as well. Got a great show for you today. We have Liz Weston on the show. Liz works at MSN, writes for MSN, and she's the author of some wonderful personal finance books. She has written what I think is probably the best book on credit scores that you can find anywhere. And today we'll talk a little bit about that, but actually going to focus on another book that she's written and recently updated and revised, and it's called Deal with Your Debt, which I know is an issue that a lot of us struggle with. And so I was grateful that Liz was willing to come on the show. We'll hear from her in just a few minutes. First, though, we want to talk about the money tool of the day, and I actually picked this one because I think it fits nicely with Liz's message in her book, and that's the tool of the day is YNAB, which is short for You Need a Budget. It's what I think, though, the best, certainly one of the best budgeting tools that you can find anywhere. It's the tool that I use for our budget. And I think it's particularly helpful for those trying to get out of debt. And I think it's helpful in at least three ways. First, like perhaps any budgeting tool, it forces you to see where your money is going. And I think that's critical to understand how you're spending your money, if there are places where you can cut back. You know, if you don't track your money, and I don't think you need to track it every day, every week, every month. I think it's fine maybe to track it every 1 month a quarter or 1 month every 6 months. But if you track it periodically, I think you'll just be surprised at where the money goes. I know I am when I track our money. And again, I don't track it dollar for dollar every month. Sometimes I just track a couple of categories of spending that I know are giving us trouble. But whatever you decide to do, YNAB is a very easy tool that helps you see where your money is going each month. The second thing I like about YNAB is it encourages you to give every dollar you have a job. And let me explain. You may have tried to set up a budget, and I know I've done this in the past, where maybe you open up Excel or perhaps you're in some other budgeting tool, and you start listing all of the categories of spending and what you think you spend each month in each category. And some of them, you may know down to the penny, like your mortgage or your rent, car payment, school loan. For others, you may have to guess a little, like utilities that can fluctuate from month to month. And of course, then there's things like food and clothing. And you go through and you kind of figure out in your mind what do you think you spend on these categories, and that process is okay. But the problem is it's often divorced from reality, right? I mean, it sometimes isn't tied to actually what you have in the bank and what you have to spend. And YNAB takes a different approach, and this took me a little while to wrap my mind around. But what YNAB does is says forget coming up with sort of a monthly budget per se. Instead, how much money do you have in the bank right now? And whatever that is, it then says, okay, how are you going to spend that money until your next paycheck? And you go through your whatever categories of spending you have, and you type in how you're going to spend that money. You're going to spend some on groceries. Maybe you need to buy some clothes. Maybe you have a credit card bill you need to pay. Maybe you're going to save some of it. Right? That's, it's important to give a dollar that kind of job, saving, as it is to give it a job, say, buying groceries for you. But however you're going to spend it, here's what you have in the bank. Now, think about it and figure out exactly where that money's going to go. And YNAB makes it very easy to do. And then, of course, when you get your next paycheck in, you do the same thing. You give every dollar a job. So the thing is you're dealing with reality. You're dealing with the money that you actually have in the bank account, and you ask yourself, how am I, or how is my family going to spend this money until the next paycheck? And I think that really helps, really for budgeting in general, but it also helps when you're trying to climb out of debt, because you're usually juggling, the debt payments. You're trying to avoid going into more debt, and of course, you're just trying to keep the family afloat. And intentionally giving every dollar a job, I think, enables you to put your money to its highest and best use. So that's the second thing. The third thing that YNAB does that I think is very helpful is it encourages you to live on last month's income. So in other words, you should have 1 month's worth of income or expenses in the bank. So when you're budgeting, say, for April, you're actually allocating money that you earned and got paid in March. And that's the example I'm using now as I record this podcast just a few days before April. And you say, well, I can't do that. I'm not anywhere close to being a month ahead. Well, YNAB understands that. YNAB understands that you're not going to be starting out maybe in the best place, and it may take you some time to get to this point. And through the various tools it has, as well as the educational resources, there's a great forum, there's great video tutorials that they have available for you. It'll help you get to that point where you're living on last month's income. And I think that's just a great way to prepare for those uncertainties in life that all come our way, usually at the absolute worst times. But I think that's really important for those struggling with debt and trying to climb out of debt. So that's the money tool of the day. It's YNAB, YNAB, and I'll leave links to it as well as my reviews in the show notes. Check it out. Okay, with that, let's turn over to the interview with Liz. Liz, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rob.
Hey, I'm so thrilled that you were able to take a few minutes out of your busy day to talk to us. I've enjoyed your books and your writing at MSN and other places. Your book on credit scores was probably the first book of yours that I read. And it's interesting, our son, who's now 20, I think, he actually took that book without asking me because he wanted to read it from cover to cover.
Wow.
And he's not really into the let's save a lot of money right now. He's into the what kind of car can I buy?
Yeah.
But he took that book and read it from cover to cover. And I just read your deal with your debt book, and wanted to talk to you about that. I think a lot of folks that listen to this podcast can learn a lot from that. Before we sort of dive into your books, though, just for those that maybe aren't as familiar with you, can you just kind of give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, I've actually been covering personal finance for 2 decades now, which seems like a really, really long time. I started out as a newspaper reporter. I was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times for several years. And then I went to MSN and started writing with them. And the credit scoring book kind of evolved because nobody else had written a similar book for the consumer market. You could find a lot of academic books, you could find books for people in the industry, but nobody was explaining to the consumer how their credit information was affecting their ability to get loans, their ability to get insurance. A lot of insurers use the credit information in insurance scores. They weren't talking about how landlords increasingly were using credit scores to evaluate you. So I thought it was time to kind of take some of the mystery out. And my timing was pretty good because right about the turn of the last century was when FICO started lifting the veil a bit and letting us know a lot more about it. I think consumer advocates had really been putting pressure on them to say, hey, look, this is such an important score. And at the time, you weren't even able to see your score. There were agreements with these companies between the credit bureaus and the lenders and FICO that they would not reveal the scores to consumers. And that was just blatantly unfair. So little by little, we started to learn that, yes, they existed, and here's how they're used, and here's how they're created. And we know a lot more about them than we ever did.
Yeah, we kind of take it for granted today, how easy it is, whether you're going to look at a FICO score or perhaps a different formula, but how easy it is to, one, get your report. Of course, that's free online. And then, two, to get your credit score, and there are tools to analyze it and know what's helping it and what's hurting it. When my wife and I bought our first home, of course, the internet didn't exist as we know it today. I had no clue what a credit score was or what ours was. You just applied and you either got approved or you didn't.
Well, and I think the way that people found out about them is that their mortgage professional might say, "Hey, your credit scores are really good, or your credit scores aren't that great." That might have been the first time that a lot of people ever heard that there was such a thing as credit scores. Now, the formulas date back, or the fact that there is credit scoring dates back to like the 1950s. This is something that started in World War II and started to be more, adapted to more applications and retail and all that, starting through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was when FICO started applying the formula not just to a retailer's individual database of information about people, but to the credit bureaus. That's when it really exploded in terms of usefulness to the lenders. A lot of people adapted it. And then about the mid-90s is when Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, who buy most of the mortgages out there, said, okay, they gave their blessing to credit scores, and that's when it really, really started taking off.
Okay. And how long ago did you write your book on credit scores?
The first edition, I want to say, was 2004. It was right after my daughter was born, and I still can't figure out how I did that.
I'm actually going to ask you about that in a minute, so just hold that thought. But, the thing is the research for that book had to have been a lot more difficult then than it would be if you were writing that book today. I mean,
well, I benefited from a lot of things, and one was a really good relationship with Fair Isaac, which became FICO. And that was because, I started really diving into this when I was at the Los Angeles Times. So I had that, institutional sort of backing so I could, call up Fair Isaac and actually get a phone call back. And I just established a great rapport with Craig Watts, who happened to be the PR guy at the time, and just kept asking questions. And, just having those reporter skills of being able to, then out who has the answers, go to them, get them to talk, that really came in handy back then.
I bet. Yeah. And then when did you originally write your book, Deal with Your Debt? I know you've revised it in the most recent version, I think 2013, which is what I've read recently. But when did you originally write that book?
That was, I think, the next book after Your Credit Score. So I want to say it came out around 2006. I know it was pre-recession.
Okay.
Because when I went back to rewrite it, a lot of things had to change because, the whole credit market had been blown up and had to be reassembled. The basic principles I was talking about stayed the same. And one piece of advice I actually lifted directly from the one book and put it in the revised book, which is, don't rush in to buy a home. Buy it when it's right for you. And I said that, before the mortgage mess, and I'm saying it now. It's just not a decision that you can rush into.
See, a lot of people should have listened to you before the market. I can remember just when the market was going up and up, there'd be conversations at work, and the folks that were renting, you could just see it on their face. They were just downcast because these prices were going up monthly. Yeah. And it was almost an emotional toll on them. They felt like they were missing out. And then, of course, it crashed, and then they had smiles on their faces, and the rest of us were all bummed out.
And those of us giving advice would take a lot of crap for telling people to wait and telling people, no, you can't afford that mortgage that your mortgage broker tells you can afford. Yeah. It's crazy. And you keep saying it, and you keep getting this pushback. And I wish I'd saved this letter because I got a letter from some 24-year-old mortgage broker who told me that interest rates would never go up and his clients would never have a problem refinancing these scary, scary loans he was going to put them in. And I just thought that's a level of naivete and confidence you can only have at 24.
Right.
Once you get a few more miles on you, you realize, wait a minute, the world is always changing. Whatever goes up is going to come down, and this is just not sustainable.
Well, everything reverts to the mean. And so if they're too high, they're going to come down. If they're too low, they're eventually going to go up. And that's true whether it's interest rates or the stock market or whatever. Well,
I think you can have a spiral. You can start moving upward. But yeah, I think that's something you really have to think about anytime somebody is telling you it's different this time.
Right.
Listen to their rationale, but just remember that very few things really do change, in the fundamentals.
Right. So what exactly, you mentioned the credit crisis. Was that, or were there other things that led you to revise your book, Deal with Your Debt, last year? What caused you to go back to that book and make some changes?
Well, it was actually my publisher's idea, FT Press, which is an arm of Pearson. And, I had kind of let them know that my plate was really full, didn't want to write any books. But they said, you know what, this is a book that's been out there for a while, and a lot of things have changed. And it was true with the credit scoring book as well. It just came out in the 4th edition right before that. And the fourth edition was a complete rewrite of the third edition because so much had changed. And when I looked at Deal with Your Debt, I thought, as I just said, the principle's still the same, but a lot of the details are different. So we need to talk to people about this. And I also wanted to kind of, there's some debt advice out there that's commonly repeated, and it's not necessarily the best idea for a big chunk of the population. So I wanted people to have the skills that they would get, say, from a professional, comprehensive personal financial planner. Not everybody can afford, a full-fledged financial plan from a fee-only planner. But if they could, they would be getting more sophisticated debt advice than they're actually getting in a lot of venues. So I just wanted to, get the information out there for those who want to take it, that there are ways to manage your debt, to get ahead financially, and they may not be what you've already been told.
So can you give us some examples? What are some common things that you hear about dealing with debt that you think are either wrong or perhaps just not right in every situation?
I really worry about people who are prioritizing debt over everything else. Now, one of the things I know about people who get into debt is they tend to be the kind that, look for short-term solutions. It's either instant gratification or I'm going to borrow some money to solve this problem. So they tend to be wired for the short term to start with. And then when they finally realize what they've cost themselves, they want to get out of debt instantly. And they want to do it as quickly as possible. Well, here's the problem with that. All of us, or almost all of us, let's say 90% of us, are going to get to retirement age. And what we know is that people are not saving enough. And we also know that retirement is very, very expensive, and it's probably going to go on longer than you think. Most of the people who get to age 65 are going to live to at least another 20 years. Okay, so that's a big chunk of time to have to, just basically get by on your savings and Social Security. So what people really need to hear is that retirement savings have to be the top priority from day one, from your first job. Even if you have debt, you need to take advantage of that 401k at work. Hopefully it has a match. That would be great. Even if it doesn't, you need to start chunking money away, and you need to leave that money alone to grow. And the problem is people are putting that off. And the longer you put it off, the more it costs you to try to catch up, until pretty soon it's impossible or virtually impossible. If you look at somebody who starts saving in their 20s and they save 10%, 15%, they're going to be fine when they get to retirement. They might even be able to retire early. If you put it off until your 50s, you're going to have to save 40 to 50% of your income to match what you would have had if you'd had that earlier start. And a lot of people simply can't do that. They have too many expenses. So that's a long answer to your question, but basically people need to know retirement has to come first no matter what. Fit the debt repayment around that. And don't be in such a rush to pay off things like a low rate tax deductible mortgage, fixed rate tax deductible student loans. Yes, you want to pay those off eventually, but if you start throwing all your money at those debts and you don't take advantage of the retirement savings options you have, you are going to be poor in the long run. And I don't want you to be poorer. I want you to be richer. So that's the message I wanted to get out.
Yeah, I think that's so important. You and I are on the exact same page, because I know there are a lot of folks out there that say, no, pay all your debt off first.
It's because they can't do the math. And, heaven love them. I know they're trying their best and they really want to help people with this advice. But if you do the math, if you really understand the power of compounding, you wouldn't give that advice. You'd understand what you're costing people by telling them, ignore retirement for 10, 15 years and deal with your debt. It's like, oh man, you are costing people so much in the long run.
Yeah. The other thing, I think maybe, I don't know if it's a psychological component, but if you had, debt and you could just, you were very well disciplined and you paid it off in a year, or you paid it off in a year and a half. And then you started saving for retirement. That might not be the end of the world if you took that approach, except that that's not what people do. They pay off some debt and then they go into a little more debt, right?
Yes.
And then they pay it off. And these may be very responsible. I mean, this describes my wife and I when we were younger. Mm-hmm. And but if you follow the pay off your debt first, you're going to end up, like you said, you could be 10 years out or longer before you start saving for retirement.
Yeah, and the example I try to give people is, okay, maybe you're only not saving for a year or two. Well, follow that out. Every $1,000 that you're not saving in your 20s is going to cost you probably $20,000 in lost future retirement income, maybe even more. And that's assuming, that, even if you adjust that for inflation, that's a ton of money that you're giving up. So it's not just like, oh, this isn't, I'm not saving, but, I can catch up later. Most people, as you said, are not going to do that. And if they were extremely disciplined about the whole thing and could pay it off quickly and then get on the road, that'd be great. But, a lot of people don't.
Well, let's talk about debt. And I've got a couple of quotes from your book I'd like to throw at you and if you could just kind of give us a little background. One is this: debt is a tool that, if handled properly, can help you create wealth. What does that mean?
Oh, that's one that just makes the hair stand up on the back of the anti-debt crowd. Here's the deal, is that in certain situations, borrowing money can help you get ahead. It can be an investment in your future. And the example we commonly give is a mortgage. If you go to a financial planner, they'll talk to you about good debt, and that's an example of a good debt. Now, you can overdose on good debt, definitely. But here's the idea with a mortgage, is you're borrowing money, you're paying it back over time, you're building equity. At the end of your mortgage, you are going to be wealthier than when you started. Similar thing with federal student loans. And notice I say federal there. There are a lot of people who cannot pay cash for a 4-year college education. And we are very well aware that a 4-year college education is increasingly the ticket to staying in the middle class, not even just advancing, but just staying in the middle class. So college education is going to be becoming more and more important. If you can't afford it, the idea that, oh no, just do without it is kind of insane. If you want to be able to build wealth and grow your income and grow your wealth over time, that college education is really important. So people need to be able to get it. And sometimes the only way they can get it is with a low rate, fixed federal student loan. Mm. And so that's a good debt. You pay it down over time, and it pays off in terms of increased income. Does it in every single case? No. There are people who can screw this up. They can borrow too much. They can major in the wrong thing. They can come out of school and not make any more than when they started. But those are the rare exceptions. Most people do significantly better once they have that degree under their belt.
Well, I'm gonna jump out of. I've got my nice, well prepared notes for the interview today, but I'm gonna jump out of line because of what you just said. Or jump out of my sequence here, and I'm scrolling down to some notes towards the bottom about student loans, because you said something that I had never heard before, and but I think it's spot on. And here's what you said: limit. I'm kind of rephrasing. This is not a quote, but you said limit total borrowing for school loans to no more than your expected first year salary. Do I have that right?
Yes.
So if you think you're going to make $50,000 in your first year, that would be the total for all 4 years that you would borrow.
Yeah.
Now, how did you come to that? Is that sort of a well-known? Maybe I'm just in the dark, or is that sort of a well-known sort of rule of thumb for school loans?
Yeah, it's out there. Now, when I originally did the numbers, I looked at what career counselors and debt counselors and financial planners said about how much debt you should have. And they basically said, okay, about 10% of your income is the most that you should be spending to repay a student loan. And I kind of, reverse engineered it given the interest rates at the time, and went, okay, that's about, that could be maybe 2/3 to, 100% of what you're borrowing. Of what you expect to make your first year out. And then I started shopping that idea around to a bunch of different sources, and they all came up, it's a general thing. I mean, if you are getting a law degree and you're going to work in the public defender's office for a couple of years and then go out into private practice, your income's going to soar typically. So, you may be able to stretch that a bit. But in general, it's a good idea to kind of look out at least and see what you are training for, see what the incomes are likely to be, and make sure that you put some kind of lid on your savings. I'm not saying it's a hard and fast line. I'm saying it's something to keep in mind. If you go over that limit, just keep in mind that it's going to be tougher and tougher to pay that loan back. It's going to start affecting your life. You're going to wind up being one of those people probably who has to put off buying a house, who may have to put off other goals because you've got this student loan debt.
Yeah. One of the things I like about the way you've approached it and thinking in terms of your first year salary, again, as you said, it might be a little higher or lower. It's just a rule of thumb, but it forces you to ask some questions like, okay, what degree am I going to get and what's its value?
Yeah.
And what school am I going to attend?
Because the schools won't necessarily tell you, hey, nobody's, getting jobs in this major anymore. I mean, it takes a while institutionally for them to kind of revamp to the market. So we really have to be a little bit more savvy. And that's a lot to ask a 17-year-old, frankly. to think that far ahead.
Well, I see the CNN stories or whatever, and I cringe. I feel sorry for the folks, but they're in their early 20s. It's always the story of someone who owes like $200,000.
Yeah.
And I always ask myself, okay, I have a sense, I know what degree they got, and I scroll down, and it's a liberal arts degree from a private institution, and I'm thinking, why did you do that? I mean, I went to law school, but I got a liberal arts degree. I got an English degree. So I'm not criticizing, liberal arts kind of education. It's what I have. But you really need to think realistically about what your job prospects are going to be and how much you're going to make before you go out and pile up that kind of debt that you can't, depending on what it is, you can't discharge it in bankruptcy, right?
Right, exactly.
And it could be an anchor around your neck for a long time.
Well, and the media, being a journalist, I'm part of the media, and I like those dramatic stories of the undergraduate who's piled up, $250,000 of student loan debt. They are the outliers. I mean, the idea that everybody's walking around with those levels of debt is just, it's nuts. Most people, students graduating today definitely have more debt than they did several years ago. And that's because the cost of college, the net cost of college, keeps going up. It's basically doubled since the 1980s.
Wow.
And most kids are coming out with somewhere around $28,000, $29,000 in student loans. I'm not worried about that as an average. They're going to be able to pay that off just fine. The ones with those crazy six-figure loans for the undergraduate degree, a lot of times those are first-generation college students. Mm-hmm. They don't have parents who could have told them, honey, I don't think that's going to pay off, because their parents have no experience with the college system. So those are the kids I really worry about. The ones that are the first in their family to go to school, they get their sights on some dream school, and they're paying, based on what their parents' income and assets might be, which could be substantial. I mean, even if you haven't been to college, in our generation, you can still build up some wealth. So they could be, without very much financial aid, or the financial aid they get is all loans, something like that. Those are the kids that are greatly in danger because they're not, getting really good advice about limiting debt and making sure that what they're majoring in actually has a market that's growing and actually will pay them something when they get out.
Yeah. Well, one of the resources you mentioned in your book is the National Association of Colleges and Employers. I guess they have a website with starting salary data, and I will link to that in the show notes.
It's also Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps those kind of numbers as well. But I just found that the other one is a little bit easier to navigate.
Okay. All right. Well, let me get back into my outline here, my notes. But I know college education is critical, and the debt, it's a big issue for a lot of people. So I definitely wanted to focus some time on that.
Yes.
So let's talk about tackling your debt. Which debt should you tackle first?
I tell people to look at their toxic debt, make that their highest priority. Again, assuming that they're getting on track with retirement savings, taking advantage of the 401k, whatever. Now they need to look at whatever debt is really eroding their financial security, and that's going to be the higher rate debt, the variable rate debt, the debt that has no tax advantages. So credit cards, classic example, that's toxic debt. There's worse debts, obviously. There's payday loans, bank bounce fees. If you've been using your line of credit or a bounce overdraft kind of thing, that is very expensive debt. Title loans, pawn shops, all that stuff. That's really high rate debt. And payday loans are something that really came up out of nowhere. If you look in the early 90s, hardly any. If you look now, I've been told there are more payday loan outlets than there are McDonald's and Burger King's combined.
Wow.
I'm not sure if that number is still accurate, because what happened was the military was getting sick of their soldiers getting wrapped up in these awful high rate loans. So they essentially banned lending money to military folks for greater than 36% interest. And what you saw was almost overnight, those payday loan places disappeared from around the bases, which was a blessing for the poor soldiers that were getting taken. So there were fewer than there were at their peak, but there's still so many of these outlets, and there's still so many people who don't realize how dangerous that is. So that's my little soapbox. I'll get off now and basically say, if you have any of that kind of debt, credit card debt, payday loans, whatever, the high rate debt, that is what you should be focusing on, taking care of that first. Okay.
And that's effectively, and this is something you, of course, mentioned in your book, paying the highest rate first. You also talk about the alternative, one alternative approach, the paying the smallest balance first, the pros and cons there. But one approach that was interesting to me was paying off a debt where you're closest to maxing out your credit limit for that card.
Yeah, it used to be that having that you had a problem with that because if you had maxed out a card or even come close, that is going to affect your credit scores. That's going to push it down. That's still true. What's not still true is that in the past, lenders were able to jack up your existing interest rates because of that. So that's when I was telling people focus on, if you have something close to the limit, you want to pay it down because you could be chasing that interest rate higher and higher.
Right.
It's not true for the existing balances, but the credit card issuers can still do that for balances going forward. So my feeling is if you do have some maxed out cards, I might focus on those first just to give your credit score a break, just to get that, payment down. And the part about paying the small balances first, it doesn't make sense mathematically, but there has been research to show that people who do that tend to pay off more debt. So I'm not going to say don't do it. Mathematically, it makes sense to go for the higher debt first, but whatever works is what works.
Yeah, I think the key is that for folks to understand the pros and cons of each approach.
Yes.
Figure out what's best for them. And I've had readers email me and say, I kind of did both. I started with the smallest debt because I needed that sort of emotional boost
Yes.
to have something paid off. And then once I got one taken care of and I felt more confident in myself and tackling this debt, I then went to the highest rate because I had the confidence I needed.
Yeah.
Which I thought was perfect. Yeah.
Exactly.
So a question on the credit limit. So obviously, and I interviewed, Tom Quinn at FICO. I don't know if you've ever.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great guy. I interviewed him. It's actually, I think, my second podcast. I interviewed Tom,
Oh,
and we talked a lot about credit utilization. I don't know if I asked him this question, but I'll ask you. You can max out a credit card. Say you've got a $10,000 limit and you've got $10,000 balance, but of course you may have other credit cards. And they may have a lot more credit available. So do the folks at FICO and other credit scoring models, do they look at it on a card-by-card basis, if you know, or do they aggregate all your revolving debt and say, well, let's look at your utilization for all of it combined?
Both.
They do both. Okay.
They do both. And that's why people who have a lot of debt on a single card would probably be better off spreading it around. It's a little counterintuitive to have, to do that. But actually, if you do want to improve your credit scores fairly quickly, you do want to look at that credit utilization. Because if you are maxing out one card or two cards and you have a lot of other available credit, that really is hurting you. Because it does look at the overall, but it also looks on each individual card. Okay. So spread it around and then pay it off.
Well, that's good to know because, you mentioned a little bit in your book about balance transfers. Yeah. And that's what my wife and I did when we were getting out of credit card debt. We just rolled it over until it was gone.
Mm-hmm. As long as you use those balance transfers as an excuse me with the phone going off.
That's okay.
As long as you use the low rate balance transfers as a way to pay off more of your debt, that works. The people I worry about are the ones that just keep skipping the balances from one card to another. And also, I don't know if Tom brought this up, but if you pay your balances in full every month, which is what you should be doing. That's the absolute, if I could tell everybody in the world one habit to develop besides saving, regularly, it's pay off your credit card balances in full. Even you are affected by that credit availability thing. And that comes as a surprise to people because they say, why should I worry about it? I pay it off in full. The balance that's reported to the credit bureaus is the balance on a certain day. It might be your statement closing date. It might be some random day of the month. So even if you paid the balance in full the next day, the credit bureaus wouldn't know that because that's not the number that they were reported to. And those numbers at the credit bureau are what go into your credit score. So if you are somebody like me who loves credit card rewards and is out there getting them, make sure that you don't go over about, roughly 30% of your credit limit. If you're starting to do that, you might want to make a couple payments during the month to pay it down, or start using another card. Because again, it's if you watch what happens to your FICO scores when you max out even a single card, you'll realize this is a powerful part of the formula. You want to pay attention to it.
Yeah, so they take a snapshot, if you will, on a given day of the month.
Yes, and a lot of times it is the statement balance. So if I have my Chase card and I've got it up to 60% of the credit limit on the day the statement closes, I could pay it the next day, but it's still that higher balance that's being reported to the credit bureaus and incorporated into my scores.
Well, that's good to know. And I think I'm a lot like you where my wife and I use a reward card. and we basically charge almost all of our monthly expenses to that card.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, I mean, it probably still keeps it below 30% of its limit, but not every month.
Yeah.
Depends what craziness is going on in our lives. But okay, well, that's good to know. I mean, the thing about balance transfers that I found is that when you first do a transfer, it can hurt your score, both because there's an inquiry,
Yeah.
and because on the new card, your old card may have a zero balance now if you've transferred it all. That's fine. But your new card could be maxed out. And as you've said, they look at it both ways.
Yeah.
Although over time, it actually probably helped my score over time because, one, I got out of debt faster.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ended up, when we were done, with a ridiculous amount of credit because we didn't cancel any of our cards.
Yeah, and that's something, another point people need to know is that they fear having too much available credit. That's not even a reason code in the FICO formula. I mean, that's not a negative. If the formula realizes that if you've been handling those accounts responsibly, you aren't going to go out and run up a bunch of debt, all of a sudden. You aren't going to change overnight, typically. So having available credit is a good thing. You shouldn't be asking your credit issuers to lower your credit limits. You shouldn't be closing cards willy-nilly. I mean, you can, and you still keep most of the information, but having lots of available credit that you're not using is a good thing.
Okay. Good. One thing you mentioned in your book is you mentioned 720 as a FICO score. If you're below that, you want to try to get your score higher. And I was curious what was why 720?
Well, and actually that's a little, I want to say, out of date. I mean, one of the things that I explained in the book is that every lender pretty much is different. So, and every type of lending is different. So what is considered, a decent score, a good score by one lender might be kind of by another. Here's the deal. You get the best rate in terms if you have FICOs of 740 or above. If you want the absolute best rate in terms on almost every loan, 760 is going to be the sweet spot. There's very few lenders that cut lines above that. If you go below, some interesting things happen. Used to be 620 was considered subprime. And if you were below that, you'd have to pay a lot more for your credit if you could get it. After the financial crisis, the mortgage mess, the credit crunch, all that, what was considered subprime really moved up. I mean, there were people who had 660, 680 scores that were being treated as subprime. So now that seems to be settling back down. But the one thing to keep in mind is credit is a moving target. Your credit changes all the time. Your credit scores are changing all the time. The lenders are changing their policies all the time. So we try to give people some rules of thumb and general guidelines. But even that guideline of 30%, don't use more than 30% of your available credit. Even that's blurry because, it's not as if 40% is awful. What it means to say is that 30% is good, 20% or less is better, 10% or less is best, sort of a sliding scale. So there's just things to keep in mind rather than hard and fast rules. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I think part of it, too, there's a practical side to this, and that is have a sense as best you can as to why you'll need your credit. In other words, if I were going to buy a home in the next 12 months, or if I plan to refinance my mortgage, I would not be doing a balance transfer, for example, or doing other things, getting other credit unless I absolutely had to. And I'd be very mindful, as you've said, of my credit card balances because my credit's going to really matter in a very big way when I go to sign that mortgage.
Yeah.
But for my wife and I right now, we've got a low mortgage. We're not moving. So it's not that we don't care about our credit, but I guess the point is that folks need to kind of plan ahead and say, okay, there are times when your credit's really, really going to matter. And to do the things that you've described to help keep it up as high as they can.
Yeah, because every point can count. And you don't want to be missing out on the best rate because you opened a Macy's card, for example.
Right.
If you're going to be in the market for a major loan, you just stop those other activities and just wait until you're done.
That's a great point. All right, so here's another question that you talked about in your book. Should a credit card or maybe even a home equity line of credit, should you ever rely on those as an emergency fund?
This was something I was first told by a financial planner in the 90s, and I thought she was out of her mind because I was raised, debt is evil. Debt's a four-letter word. You try not to have any of it other than your mortgage, and you pay that off as quickly as you can. And she just sort of threw out this thing of, I have all my high net worth clients. They all have home equity lines of credit. And I'm like, really? And I kind of dived into it and realized that especially with those high net worth folks, if things go wrong, they can go catastrophically wrong. If you have a 6-figure income and you lose your job, it can take months, years. Maybe you won't ever get back up to that level. So, she wanted her clients to have healthy emergency funds, but she also recognized that life happens and emergency funds can go away. So you want to have that backup. And also, as I started to research it more, I realized that it takes a typical family years to build up even 3 months worth of, an emergency fund worth 3 months of their essential expenses. And that's because, even if you're cutting your expenses and saving that money, it just takes a long time to build those up. So you want to have something in the meantime. Now, if you're paying off your credit cards, you're opening available credit. So in an emergency, you could use that. But it could also be a good idea to have that home equity line of credit open and unused. And that's the two important parts, because, if you try to go get a home equity loan after you lose your job, you're going to have a tough time. And if you use all your available credit on that home equity line to go to Walt Disney World and have great trips and buy a car and whatever, it won't be there when you need it. So the whole idea is get it open before it's a crisis and keep it open and unused. And here in California, we have a lot of experience with earthquakes. And the thing with earthquakes is, even if you have insurance, tends to be a whopping deductible, 10, 15%. So if you don't have that money sitting in cash somewhere, having that home equity line open, ready to go, is really important when you want to rebuild. And the thing is, you will not be able to get a home equity line of credit on the rubble that once was your house.
Right.
That's why you have to do it in advance.
Yeah, we relied on our home equity line of credit when we were climbing out of debt. And one thing it allowed us to do was not effectively, we didn't have an emergency fund. Mm-hmm. And the idea was, rather than sticking cash in a low-interest savings account, I can put it to work getting rid of my debt while I continue to save for retirement. And we were fortunate enough never really to have to draw on the home equity line of credit, but it was there if we needed it.
That's it. A lot of people are really scared of using their savings. As I said, it takes so long to build that up. The idea that you would take that chunk and use it to pay down your debt, it's like, frightening. It's like, what'll I do? Just knowing that you've got access to credit, in an emergency, can help you do the right thing with your money and get it, as you said, working for you.
Yeah. Okay. One topic that's always, I think, interesting one to debate, and one that you tackle in your book, is this: is your home an investment? What are your thoughts?
I went through 2 regional, possibly 3, if you count my early childhood, regional real estate recessions. So when on the national scene, home prices were going nuts, and people were saying, these prices will never go down because they're not making any more land, I knew that was just total bunk. And I kept saying, look, homeownership is not for everyone. And a house isn't necessarily an investment. And that you have to plan for the possibility that you may get very slow appreciation or even depreciation. And at the time, people, a lot of people thought that was nuts because they hadn't experienced it. But I'd been through it. Seattle had a period in the 70s where prices went down. And then I moved up to Alaska and prices went in the toilet when oil prices went down at that time. And then I moved to Southern California right in time for that, big real estate recession. So I'd been through it so many times. I knew that you couldn't count on this, endless appreciation that other people seem to think was guaranteed. Okay. The other thing is, when you start doing the math on home ownership, you realize how much you're spending in terms of property taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs, upgrades. And I remember in the 90s sometime, the Wall Street Journal actually looked at it, and I think they figured out you paid for your house 2 or 3 times over in a 30-year ownership period. So the idea that, you're getting all this wonderful appreciation and you're not paying for it, doesn't really work out. And if you actually, what people get excited about is, their parents buy a house for $25,000 and they sell it for $250,000, decades later. If you just looked at inflation over time, they're basically getting the rate of inflation and no better. And even if you do a little bit better than inflation, probably once you factor in all the costs of ownership, you're back to inflation or even below it. So that's why I want to bring up the point that I think home ownership is great. It's worked out wonderfully for me in our family, but it's not necessarily a slam dunk. And it's not, your home is basically a consumption asset. It's something that you're using. It's a place where you live. It's not really an investment. If it works out that way in the long run, great, but don't count on it.
Yeah. I think that's how I think about our home as well, and particularly over the last half dozen years when the value went down. That wasn't any fun for, I guess, all of us. But I'm just curious, where did you live in Alaska?
In Anchorage.
Okay. You ever been to Skagway?
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. No, I haven't been to Skagway. I've been to Ketchikan and Juneau, but I never got to Skagway.
I spent a fair amount of time in Skagway, believe it or not, representing a client there, I'll say. But wonderful, really? Believe it or not, yeah, beautiful place. I mean, the mountains are just phenomenal.
Yeah.
That's where the cruise ships, I think, go in now, and folks can take a train up the mountain. Beautiful place. Okay, I appreciate your time today. Let me just throw one last question at you,
sure.
if that's okay. I thought this was a fantastic part of the book that I had never thought of it this way, but it has to do with car loans. And you compared two people, one who they have I guess a 5-year loan or whatever, and as soon as they pay off their car, they go buy a new one. Mm-hmm. As compared to someone who, when they get their car paid off, no, they don't go buy a new one. They drive their car for 5 more years. Then they go buy a new one. And you looked at the difference, first of all, in how much these two people would spend over a lifetime for cars, and how much the person who drives their car for 5 more years, how much they could have in the bank if they took the car payments they weren't making and invested it. Now, I know you don't have the book in front of you, so you may or may not remember the numbers. I've got them written down if you don't, but they were unbelievable.
Was it like $250,000 or was it higher than that?
Well, yeah. So what you had in there was, for someone who buys a car as soon as they pay off the last one, they spend about just under $470,000 over the course of their life. And then the $250,000 was how much the other person spent. They spent a lot less because they drive their car 5 years. The thing that struck me was, if they invest that their car payment that they're not making as they drive this car for another 5 years, of course there's assumptions involved, but over a lifetime they end up with $2.5 million in the bank.
I've done that example a couple of times now, and I did revise it, trying to keep the interest rates sort of in the right ballpark. But the reality is, anybody who writes about personal finance or who does this for a while realizes that a lot of times, if people are having trouble making ends meet, it's either the house, the shelter, or what's sitting in their driveway. Mm-hmm. And we've got this idea that we need new cars. No one needs a new car. You may need a car if you don't have public transportation, but you can get by with a gently used car. But we have this idea that we need new cars, and we need them frequently. And I just wanted to sit back and do the math and show people how much they could save over a lifetime. Now, I know I'm never going to convince the car guys who are in love with cars, who have 16 cars. That's their thing. And if that's how you want to spend your money, that's totally fine. As long as you've got your retirement covered and you're not going into debt, buy as many cars as you want. I'm saying for the rest of us who are trying to balance these different financial priorities, you need to see how much that vehicle is costing you. And you need to see how much more you would have if you could just put a few restraints. And I'm not even saying hold the car for 15 years or 20 years. I'm not saying never get a loan. I'm saying just look at the difference if you hold the car for 5 more years. And these days, cars are built pretty well. They can last that long. You'll have more repair bills at the end. Trust me, I know. But overall, it's a much better value proposition to just hang on to them a little bit longer. Yeah,
that is such a good point. The debate of new versus used, I think, is a fair one to have and to figure out what's best for you. But boy, just driving it longer.
Yeah.
And I'll give a shout out to my wife, who's driving a car that we bought in 2002. And she loves it and has no plans of getting rid of it. So I'm her biggest fan.
Right.
Well, Liz, listen, I appreciate your time so much, taking the time to talk with us. It's a great book. For those listening, I'll leave a link in the show notes to where you can get, you can look at all of Liz's books. But if you're dealing with debt, for my money, your book is. The thing I like about it is it's not a one-size-fits-all. You're educating people so that they can make the right and best decision for their specific circumstances. And I think that's the way to go. But anyway, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks for the nice words.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview. As always, if you have any questions about the interview, any questions for Liz, just shoot me an email, dr@doughroller.net. and I'll be happy to do my best to answer your questions or forward them on to her and get her responses as well. So before we close out today, I do want to talk about the money tip of the day, and I wanted to work it in with the topic today and the tool I talked about at the start of the show, YNAB. And it's this: put your money to work ASAP. You know, we talked about YNAB and how it encourages you to give every dollar a job. That's important. But once you give a dollar a job, whether it's going to be for savings or paying down debt or whatever, put it to work immediately. One of the things I find is that, you may say, well, I'm going to save $250 this month. Well, that's fine. But if it sits in your checking account, if you're like me, you're going to be more likely to spend it. And so I try to put my money to work ASAP. Now, what does that mean as a practical matter? Well, for me, it means three things. The first is I take full use of direct deposit. If I can put my money to work without ever having to touch it, it goes right from my employer to the place where I want it to go, I take full advantage of that. And there are a couple of ways you can do it. I think the first and perhaps obvious way is to take advantage of a 401k. I mean, that's terrific because your employer simply takes the amount of money you decide out of your check and puts it right into your 401k. You never see it, you don't touch it. It goes right from your employer to your retirement account. The other thing you can do is actually have multiple direct deposits. You don't have to have the direct deposit, in most cases, go all to your checking account. If you're trying to save money, you can have a direct deposit, a certain amount go to, say, a savings account, and the rest go to a checking account. And so, in fact, with some employers, you can have more than two direct deposits, so they can go to a number of accounts. I try not to over-engineer this, but it can be a great way to save money so that you don't, the money doesn't hit your checking account. Maybe you have two direct deposits set up. One goes right to a savings account. The second way you can put your money to work ASAP is automate your bill pay and your savings, and we do that a lot. Most of our monthly bills, from a mortgage to utilities and cell phone bills, they're paid all automatically. It avoids, of course, the hassle of having to make the payment. It also avoids the possibility of paying a bill late. But I do the same thing with savings. So, for example, we have an automated deposit right into Betterment each month. On the first of every month, we have $100 that goes from our checking account right into our Betterment account. It happens every month as soon as we get paid on the first, and it puts that money to work immediately. And again, it's out of our checking account, so that we don't risk spending it. The third way, and this is maybe a little more old-fashioned, but is to actually physically transfer the money yourself. I have a situation where I do this, where I invest in real estate with a good friend of mine, and we've started to pay ourselves a little of a dividend. We've been investing since, let me see here, I think we bought our first two homes in 2005, I guess. So I guess it's been nine years. And we've already earned back the money that we put into the homes. And we have a business savings checking account that's got money in it for vacancies and repairs. And we're earning a nice cash flow. And so we're to a point now where we're automatically sending each of us from the account $250 a month each. Right now, I get that in the form of a check. We're going to change that. We're going to work on direct deposit to automate it. But right now, it's just the old-fashioned check comes in the mail. But what I do is I immediately go and deposit it into my checking account. And then, before I can spend it, I transfer it. In this case, I transfer it over to my Vanguard account. It's $250. Not, it's a decent amount of money. Will it make a big difference? Well, you bet. Over decades of time, that investment of $250 a month will make a big difference. And my concern is, if I just let it sit in my checking account, I'm going to spend it, not even remember where I spent it. So I don't waste any time. As soon as the check clears, I transfer it right over to Vanguard and put that money to work. So that's the money tip of the day. Put your money to work ASAP. Hope you've enjoyed the show. As always, you can reach out to me, dr@DoughRoller.net. I read and respond to every email. And you can find the show notes to this podcast. Just go to DoughRoller.net/podcast 48. Until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.